sweet. Okay, so if anyone needs the transcript or the recording, that will be up shortly. Usually a couple days after the event, those will go up. And then, yeah, if you have any trouble seeing the screen, seeing the captions, please type in the chat and I'll get started. All right, so the agenda for today. So today's workshop is going to be a little shorter. I'm trying to just make it 30 minutes instead of the full hour because I know it can be so tiring attending everything online all the time. I know my eyes are burning by the end of the day usually with just looking at screens all day. So I think we'll just keep it short, keep it sweet. And if there's more that you want to learn about, I'll share the resources that you can do on your own time when you feel like, yeah, I'm okay looking at a screen. So yeah, how I've set this up is to spend a little bit of time just chatting about disability and accessibility and what they are. For those of you that are joining again, this might be Mal, where will the transcript and recording be posted? It'll be here. I'll just share that with you. On our YouTube channel, which is just YouTube/Microsoft Reactor. I'll send the link shortly. But yeah, it'll just be on our YouTube channel. I'll put it in the chat in a bit. But yeah, so let's spend a little bit of time chatting about that, go straight into digital accessibility and app development, and then do the MSLearn module together, and hopefully, you know, get ourselves a completion badge. My goal for the end of the day is that everyone does this last final module in the accessibility fundamentals learning path for MSLearn, or hopefully we all just find value that we at least learned, you know, one new thing today. But yeah, so a little bit about what Microsoft Learn is. All the content that we're going through today is posted on there, but I've kind of digested it and already gone through it to make it really accessible for everyone. So it's just super simple, easy language, like how I'm talking to you conversationally. So it's, you know, less intimidating to kind of read through all this documentation and text. But yeah, so it's Microsoft Learn is a free online training platform that provides interactive learning for Microsoft technologies and products, but also external technologies and products. There's a bunch of fun, you know, hands-on content that's specific to your role or your goal. So for example, if you're learning how to be a software developer or a project manager, you can kind of sort through that and go through all the trainings that a software developer would have taken. Or you can also go through specific learning paths for different technologies. Like if you want to learn Power BI or Azure, you can just go through that, and then has a whole list of things like starting from beginner to expert that you can go through to kind of, you know, qualify yourself for a certification at the end. Most of these kind of technical programs will have certifications or courses that you can take at the end of it, which really certifies you. So if you want to apply for a job or something, you can prove that, yeah, I've done all this learning. And there's a bunch of other programs as well, like LinkedIn Learning has a bunch of courses like Coursera and Udemy. They're all pretty much the same. The good thing about Microsoft certifications is that they're all put on by Microsoft. So if you're learning any Windows technologies or Azure Cloud or anything like that, you can just take it from the actual organization that created that technology. So yeah, we'll go through the accessibility fundamentals path for today. The accessibility fundamentals one doesn't have an exam, but it does have a trophy at the end. So if you've taken any of those three above, like Intro to Disability or accessibility features or content with 365, you can share out afterwards, like share that trophy on your LinkedIn, saying that you've kind of done a little bit of the work required to being more aware and knowledge about accessibility issues. So yeah, that's what we'll go through today. Oh, thanks for sharing that, Michelle. Yeah, that's the link if you'd like to go to in the chat on accessibility fundamentals. Here, I'll put my link in there as well. Yeah, mine is just the track link, so I know how many people are going on it. But yeah, same goes to the same place. A little bit about me. Again, I know Peggy and Mal, you've joined before, so this might be a repetition for you, but my name's Eamon. I am the Reactor Program Manager for Toronto. So some of you that are joining from different meetup pages, like in London or Stockholm, there's a version of me that works for those locations as well. But I've managed the Toronto location. Outside of my work with the Reactor, I also have a children's literature and programming B Corp business, which is basically we create children's books and workshops that are inclusive for, you know, racialized young girls. There's a picture of that there. I really like that cover. It's really fun. Outside of that, I'm also a STEAM mentor and advocate and I do a lot of work in the D&I space. But in terms of relation and context to this role, I mentioned this earlier, but I used to be a UX designer for my university and for Formlabs, so I'm pretty familiar with sort of web accessibility guidelines. And now moving on to why are we talking about this? So currently there's 1.5 billion people in the world with disabilities. 80% of them live in developing countries. And this is Canada specific, but I encourage you to check this out for your own locations as well. But in Canada, about 1 in 7 people, or about like 4.5 million people, currently live with a disability. And obviously people who interact with people with disabilities, that's even larger. And we're estimated that in the next 8 to 9 years, that number will become 1 in 5 people. So a lot more folks with certain types of disabilities. And as societies are, aging, those are just going to increase. Like what we think are disabilities now are probably going to expand further quite a bit. So at some point in life, we're going to interact with people who have accessibility concerns. So that's just something to keep in mind as you, advance in your careers or live your lives. It's just something to know. And so the definition of accessibility and disability is often changing. It's different for different people, but the most common definition is that accessibility means creating experiences for people of all abilities. That's the concept of a product or service can be used by everyone and have an equal user experience for everyone, however they encounter it. So that's really something that's kind of an umbrella term that everyone in the industry uses, is just creating something that's accessible for all abilities versus creating stuff that's for the general population and then has tools in it that people with disabilities will use. I think that's not the right way to approach when you're designing something or creating something new. An important takeaway to keep in mind is that accessible designs really help everyone. Accessibility isn't really just the right thing to do, but it often brings benefits to all users. So for example, if something, if you've built in a feature in your app, it also helps people with disabilities, but it also will help people without disabilities. For example, if you have video captions or closed captions on, yes, it'll help folks who are maybe hard of hearing, but if you aren't hard of hearing and you're maybe outside in a loud place or something, those captions will still help you as well. So it's just adding features that make life easier for everyone while keeping people with disabilities in mind. So that's just something to, think about, just rethink how you approach accessibility. And there's a ton of different types of accessibility issues. Some of them will be like structural or socially built in or built in with your economy or country, or maybe like your social class, like if you're a low income earner or high income earner. But this slide has a couple of them. So visual disabilities or hearing, cognitive disabilities, speech impediments, mobility issues, or neural issues, which would be maybe like ADHD or OCD. If any of them are kind of a surprise for you, like things like anxiety is considered an accessibility concern as well. So these are, like medically considered terms, and even if you have anxiety and you work in a workplace, you can be allowed, accessibility leeways and things like that to perform your work better. Or if you're in school, you can ask for considerations as well. And something to keep in mind is that a lot of these are invisible accessibility concerns. Like if you look at someone, you're not going to be able to tell that they're suffering or dealing with those issues. So it's just something to keep in mind as you approach, how you live in the world, is that you might not often be able to tell. It's not as common or as obvious a lot of these concerns that people are dealing with on their day-to-day life. So to start off with digital accessibility topics, one of the most basic areas, especially when it comes to web design or web development, are HTML and ARIA. So has anyone in this chat ever made a website or used HTML formatting before? Are you kind of familiar with it? I mean, feel free to type it in the chat. It's just good to know where people are coming from. Yeah. Okay, I see a bunch of people are typing. Yes, kind of familiar. Okay, a little. Yeah, I know HTML. Okay, sweet. So HTML actually just goes a little bit beyond just web for the web as well. Like it's not just, for website design. You might notice that sometimes when you're typing in an email or something and you want to have something that's bolded, you might put a B in the front of it and like a /B after. So anything that's in between is bolded as well. So HTML really goes beyond that a little bit, where it's just basic formatting at its base level. What HTML stands for is Hypertext Markup Language. It allows a user to create and structure sections, paragraphs, headings, links, quotes, web pages, apps. Like, it's one of the most basic building blocks of the internet. And it's not really considered a programming language. I mean, this is controversial. Some people do, some people don't. It doesn't have the ability to create dynamic functions. But what it really does, it makes it possible to organize and format websites similar to documents like Word documents. So when you're working with HTML, you use simple code structures like tags and attributes. So those are really the words, like when it said, put a B in brackets before something and B after would bold whatever's inside. That's basically putting the B tag, like a bold tag, around something. So tags and attributes, you use that to, mark up a website page. So for example, you can create a paragraph by placing a P before and a /P after, and anything that's in between will be considered a paragraph. So when you're making a website and you put like, this is bolded, this is a paragraph, it just kind of simplifies and creates a structure for your web page. So the latest version of HTML is called HTML5, and it's recommended by the World Wide Web Consortium. It's called WC3, and it's kind of like this international community that creates web standards. They're considered almost like a holy grail in the world for web accessibility, and a lot of countries use them. Often the stuff that they put out becomes legislation in a bunch of countries. Like, they'll put out certain standards that need to be met, and then they'll be lobbied by different political groups, and then they'll come into legislative power. And that's something that's happened in Canada as well. Whatever really they've put out is considered like, that's the top of the line knowledge about web accessibility. So I'd really recommend that you go and check it out and see what other stuff they're showing there. But yeah, so for all intents and purposes, HTML5 is the current standard for the web and should really be used to build this basic structure of your website. If you plan to create accessible websites, you should really learn some of the syntax and tags for HTML5, because as HTML has been improving and these languages have been improving, the tags have been changing. So that's just something to keep in mind. And on the other hand, ARIA, which is Accessible Rich Internet Applications. It's a technical specification that works hand in hand with HTML5 to make web pages more accessible. So when we talked about tags and attributes earlier with HTML, what ARIA does is it's a set of attributes that define ways to make web content and web applications, especially those made on JavaScript, more accessible to people with disabilities. So it really is like an add-on to HTML, so that when people are interacting with your website, it uses these web widgets in a way that assistive technology can use it easier. So assistive technology would be things like screen readers. So if folks have vision difficulties or they're blind, they'll maybe use a screen reader to access your website. And so if you use ARIA tags, screen readers can use the website way better than if something doesn't have an ARIA tag. So what ARIA really does, it assigns attributes like roles, states, and properties to HTML properties. And it's part of, just gives it more like a navigation landmark. And all of this might sound like word jumble, but these two images on the screen are like an easy way to understand that concept. So in the first image, you'll see a basic HTML structure of a website. Like, there's a header, there's a navigation, there's an article section, which covers, the article would be covering everything like one section of a page, which would include a header, some other section, a footer, maybe like a sidebar or something that's like an irrelevant side of a page that's not super, content heavy. So that's just like a basic HTML structure. But on the right, you'll notice in the bold red are ARIA tags that they've added. So they've added roles where, yes, a header is the same thing as a banner, but when you're using a screen reader, it won't be the same. So because a header could be maybe a header for like a content piece, like a heading. It could be a header for the entire web page. Does the screen reader describe everything that's in the header, or can it skip it? So if you add banner, then the person who's using the website using a screen reader knows that, okay, banner, don't care about it, skip that to the next navigation structure. So it's just a way for them to navigate a website. You might notice things like role form. Yeah, it's the same thing as the HTML tag of form, but it's something that will help a screen reader use a website a lot easier, because not all of them will have the same tag. So it's just a way that you can, take that one extra step to make sure that all people can use your website really efficiently. Because often it might not just be screen readers that are using this website, even other folks. It's just a really good way to write code to make sure it's accessible across all platforms. And yeah, just something to keep in mind. So that's kind of like a basic structure of web accessibility is HTML5 and ARIA. If you want to make a website, use them. They're helpful. Use it alongside JavaScript. So the three of those together, you're really in a good spot to make a really accessible website. All right, moving on to other stuff about digital accessibility. So here's just a couple of things, but I'll give some context to them. So there's numerous accessibility checks and standards when it comes to website design, with the overall goal to provide a website design that any user can understand with ease. Accessibility concerns can range from anything like audio, navigation feedback, text, or color. It really depends, like we talked about earlier, that people have so many different accessibility concerns that you don't know how they're interacting with your content online. So we'll just go through a very, very few of them that were covered in the Microsoft Learn module, but I would really encourage you to do your own further research, and I'll provide some resources and links at the end to learn more about these things. And so I'd really recommend that you check those out. 3 of them that we're covering in the Learn module are headings and landmarks, page structure, and color. So when it's talking about headings and landmarks, people who can't really see the visual cues of a website or a web page, they rely on title and heading elements to understand how a page is structured. So HTML5 has, different sectioning elements that you can use to communicate the structure of a page. So they'll use things like, you can see in the image on the left there, they'll use header in quotations, or they'll use sidebar, main, footer. And what that means is basically just what part of the website that is. A footer is usually kind of pretty hidden down at the bottom. You're at the end of a page and you've done all your scrolling if you're at the footer. So just provides structure. If you use these properly, these HTML5 elements help people with screen readers navigate a web page, like we talked about earlier. So yeah, it's best to use the HTML5 elements in conjunction with ARIA roles, blah, blah, blah. We talked about this earlier. But yeah, you'll notice there's an element list. This just basically builds on what we talked about in the last slide. But in the element list, you'll notice it has landmarks. So when you add ARIA tags, the landmarks become a lot easier and become elements for people who are using screen readers to just see banner, navigation, main, content info. Because when you're using screen readers, it actually defines or reads aloud usually everything that's on a page. So if the main content, they know they'll skip to that and just read that. Because if they're reading aloud every single thing on a page, maybe they're spending 2 hours on your website just going through all the content. So they just want to go maybe the footer, get your contact information, and get out of the page, right? So it's just a way to make things more accessible. Page structure. So when talking about page structure, websites should include a programmatic title or proper formatting of headings. This might be kind of wordy, but I'll get into the context of it soon. If a web page doesn't have a title or using heading elements improperly, then it can be difficult for people who use screen readers to know where they are. To avoid these issues, you should always have an informative and context-appropriate page title. So for example, in this picture, it just has, these 2 title tags and it says document in the middle. Not really very descriptive, but if you were to define it for something like contact information for contacting the team or something like that, that's a really good page title. But when you're making a website, if you were to just type in that whole text, like contact information for team members or something, you're welcome. You could have just put a heading tag and made it look like a nice heading, but people don't know if the heading is actually the title. So just make sure you're using the right tags for the right content, even though it might look the exact same, but when you're navigating on a website, it's really important. You should also make sure that these programmatic headings are used where appropriate and nested properly. So when you're creating headings on a page, for example, there's things like, oh, I see some folks were typing. Oh, why use HTML5 when you can with Wix, WordPress? Yeah, so I mean, Michelle answered it really well. Depends on the purpose of the website. You might not be able to fully. Yep. So basically, to answer your question, Julian, sorry if I'm pronouncing your name incorrectly. All websites like, Wix, WordPress have, if you go and inspect it, like how Michelle mentioned, you'll notice that they all have HTML built in. What Wix and these kind of automated websites do is that it lets you, they just like make it automated and really customizable. So you pick from these generic templates that they've made and you can customize the template. So it makes that whole process a lot easier. A lot of folks type out their entire website in HTML and they'll add, fun elements to it using JavaScript. Like if you want to click on something and have a pop-up, usually HTML can't do that. So adding, fun interactive elements will come in JavaScript. And you can use things like CSS to style it. So if you wanted something with rounded edges and like a pretty colors and shadows and things like that. So all these things interact together, but obviously this is a lot of work. And you don't need to do all that work if you can just pick a template that's ready-made online and just customize that template. But what these websites do is that they'll obviously limit how much you can customize, because if you do something incorrectly, it breaks the whole website down. Where like if you're maybe, for example, you add a border around something and the border ends up being huge and the page is like floating around, everything's messed up everywhere. So what they do is they kind of limit how much you can customize. So everything kind of stays the same. It's very, it follows a nice pattern. Everything fits on the page. Everything works. So they really limit how much you can customize something. If you were to make something completely from scratch on your own, you would use HTML, CSS, JavaScript. But yeah, I would say if you're starting out, definitely try it out. Play around with things like Wix. Squarespace is really good. They have really pretty websites there. I think GoDaddy has their own website builders as well. Definitely try it out. Check and inspect the website, and you can see all the HTML there. Yeah, sorry. Okay, I'm talking too much, so I'll let you play around with that. But yeah, so something to keep in mind when we were talking about headings is that nesting headings is really important. So most websites, and HTML5 has this as well, where they have heading tags. So there's H1 for the largest heading, H2 for like a subheading, H3. So it follows a pattern. So when someone with a screen reader is kind of going through it, it's not just H1, 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 or like it breaks a pattern in H4 and then you go back to H2. And visually it might look fine to you, but for someone with a screen reader who's using maybe arrows to navigate or pressing tab to navigate, it might go all over the place. So it's best to just kind of keep it nested and in an order. Avoid using heading styles just for style reasons. So if something isn't a heading and you just want to make something look like a heading, just edit the text for it versus adding the heading tag and just being like, okay, well, if a heading 1 is like large and bold, I'm just going to add H1 and make it large and bold, but it's not really a heading. Then random text is getting picked up by the screen reader. So just best to tag things what they actually are. Like that's basically the gist of it. When you kind of misuse tags in different locations or just try to cut corners, it's a really horrible experience for people who are using it. So if you were to use website builders like Squarespace or Wix, they have their own heading styles and things like that that you can check out. And we'll talk a little bit about testing your web accessibility later, but you can actually test once you've made your website to see how accessible it really is. All right, now moving on to color. So different variations of vision impairments, including color blindness, are top concerns when it comes to visual mediums like websites. So color blindness usually is like one of the biggest things that you're really trying to be, careful of. According to this group called Colorblind Awareness, 1 in 12 men or 1 in 200 women have some form of color vision deficiency. 1 in 12 men is pretty high, so that's something that was shocking to me as well. Like 1 in 12 men statistically have some form of color deficiency, which is huge. So if you think about it, that's like if 12 people are visiting your website, at least one of them will require that your website is, and the colors on your website are being able to be seen properly. So that's just something to think about. The use of color is an essential component when creating any web page, just as it is when you're creating, any documents. Just color plays a huge part in your life when you're creating any content. So you should make sure that color is not the only visual means of conveying information. When color is used alone, people who are blind or colorblind may not be able to tell which fields are maybe required, which items are selected, and so on. So it's best to maybe use things like symbols or texts to identify items alongside using color. Oh, there you go, Michelle. Thanks for that thing. I mean, yeah, I didn't know about that at all. So it was really shocking for me too when I was doing this research that color blindness affects men on such a higher scale. I just thought it was, something that was non-binary. It didn't really matter, but yeah, that's great. That's like really important information. So yeah, when you're talking about color, ensure that text and images of text provide a color contrast ratio of 4.5 to 1. So globally, I shouldn't say globally, but it's suggested globally that you should use any color to text ratio of 4.5 to 1. And I'll explain what that means. But in some countries, this is actually legislation. So in Canada and the US, if your website is anything below that, so 4.5 to 1 ratio, you're actually not following proper legislation for website concerns. So when you're applying to be a web developer, usually that's kind of it's like an interview question. So this is just a fun tidbit, but when I was interviewing for my role to be a web designer, UX designer, they actually asked me, so what's the ratio for color contrast? Like, I don't know. So because I never just looked it up, I just visually knew like, okay, yeah, this looks like, black text on white background or white text on black background. But then we actually took a course it's called AODA, I believe. You take that test and it tells you, it just teaches you everything about actual legislation on what is legally required for you to be web accessible. So you're not just using your own biases where what you can see. So I have vision. I don't have any vision accessibility concerns. So I was just using my own vision of like, yeah, I mean, if it's accessible to me, like dark on light, light on dark, if it's visible, it's probably fine. But no, there's actually proper scientific and like calculated resources that you should go to make sure that your colors are visible. So yeah, I think the image is there where you can see that the red obviously is very visible. 4 to 1 is still below standard, but you can see that it is kind of visible. 14 to 1, great. So anything above 4.5 to 1 ratio is great. There's resources and tools online. So there's contrast analyzers, there's built-in tools. Often websites like Wix or Squarespace will say this is not visible. There's browser extensions you can add to make sure that if you're creating a website, it tells you what colors are accessible or not accessible. That's great. A few exceptions to this guideline are when you're using large text, so that's like either 14 point or above or 18 point or above, that can have a lower ratio of 3 to 1. So if it's large text, it can have a lower ratio, so that red color would be fine, that white on blue would be perfectly fine, but that white on green would not be fine. Any things that are part of not really interactive, so just decoration images or decoration text or like borders and stuff, they don't need to be color contrast accessible either. Anything that's a logo or a brand name doesn't need to have a minimum contrast requirement. So if that's a certain type of logo, it doesn't have to be if you're using, like, for example, the Microsoft logo on a white background and maybe the green of that logo isn't really fully visible, it doesn't stand out, that's perfectly fine. It's a part of a logo, so it doesn't have to adhere to those guidelines. Here's two websites that I really like. One is called Colorable. Colorable just checks your colors and gives you good recommendations on, different color contrast tools. So purple on green, not really that great, but it's not really very aesthetically pleasing for people without vision difficulties either. So that's just an example, but it gives really good suggestions. Color Safe is really great where you enter a background color. So when you're making a website, enter your background color, the text you're using, the point, like how large it is, how small it is, and it generates a color palette for you. The good part is it actually gives kind of more aesthetically pleasing color palettes. So if that purple and green was perfectly safe, it still wouldn't be recommended because it's not very pretty. So Color Safe is also a really good tool. Another really great website that I'd mention here, I'll put a link to that here. Okay, I'll type it in after, but it's called WAVE, Website Accessibility Evaluation Tool. And what you can do is it's kind of created by this web AIM platform, and it's an organization devoted to making web content accessible to people with disabilities. And you just enter any website in that tool and it'll find, like, it'll test the accessibility of that website. So I tried it out with like the Microsoft website. I tried it out with LinkedIn and a bunch, and it'll kind of point out like this part, too small text. Oh, Michelle said color blindness controlled by a gene on the X chromosome. So for women to get color blindness, you have to do anything. Okay, that's really good to know. Thanks for doing that research, Michelle. But yeah, for those who are just listening in, Michelle posted a comment in the chat about how, we chatted about how like a lot more men are susceptible to vision difficulties with color blindness than women. But so she just put some stats about that in the chat. But yeah, and so recently there was actually a lot of buzz in the web design world about web accessibility because what happened with like the US election. So as the new administration changed, they actually updated the White House website, whitehouse.gov website. So with the Trump administration, the website was not very accessible at all. It had a lot of broken links, broken pages. If you clicked on something, it didn't usually go to another page. It was all messed up. But now, as like the day the Biden administration came in, they added a ton of accessibility features like high contrast mode, which is like a dark mode basically, but high contrast will also help people with color blindness issues. It has toggle mode to make the font size larger and smaller, so you can just kind of play around with it. Here, I'll type in the colorable URL. So the last slide will have all these links, but if you want to check it out right now, here, I'll just type that in and find it for you. Colorable. Here. There you go. Oh yeah, no worries. I mean, I'd rather you check it out as you're, talking about it, but I love this website. And it's like super simple, just one pager, and you can play around with it to test certain things out. You can randomize it and like figure out what's on there. But yeah, okay, so going back to the slides. Okay. But yeah, anyway, like the White House website now looks great. People love it. It's way more accessible. It even has like when you're, signing up for certain things, it has pronouns on a drop-down bar, which it didn't have before. So it's definitely just like that change, and the user experience has just enhanced so much further. So definitely check that out. All right, so one of the last few things in the digital accessibility section, and I know we're like going a lot over the time a little bit. I think I said that I'd cover the content in 30 minutes, but we're past that already. But yeah, so data tables, links, images, and alt text. So data tables would just be any kind of table. So if your website has a table, they can be very difficult for assistive technology applications to read, like screen readers. So in order to make them as accessible as possible, make sure you're using the right HTML table elements in the code. So, even when you're using these tables on other websites like Squarespace or Wix, if you can edit the HTML there to make sure you add these tags in, please do so. So things like table header, table body, table row, table height, size, whatever it is, just add them in the text. I've added a little image with like table row and so on there, but please go in and check your tables on the website, because screen readers, it's really hard for them to read tables because it doesn't really follow a pattern. You might be reading it vertically and then this way, and it's really difficult. So identifying the proper table headers, please do so. Use the th element, th tag in your HTML. And then with more complex tables where it has two different rows of headers, you can have things like row group or column group. And there's a bunch of different tags for that. So if you are working on that, please look that up. I'll give some resources at the end. check those out because table headers, data tables are often like the most difficult to read by screen readers. It's also difficult even if you were to put it in like an email, like a table in an email or something, or even on Excel if you were to make a table. Just screen readers have difficulty with tables, so just make sure you identify it properly because then they can read through it properly. And for links, so links is a really common thing that I thought was, I didn't think it was something that was really a big deal until I was doing research for this. And then I realized, actually, yeah, it is a big deal, especially for people who are using screen readers or assistive technology, because people who use screen readers may navigate a web page by viewing a list of the web page's links. So if you don't have sections in your website, it's just like a common text with a bunch of links in it. People might actually let me just read your comment. Do data tables need exceptions? Yeah, so charts, sometimes you need alt text if it's like an image, but other times you don't because it'll just read it like a text. So you don't always need alt text in it. But yeah, so people with screen readers sometimes navigate by just going through the links. So how in that elements list, it kind of grouped all the things together. All the links are usually grouped together, and people with screen readers will just jump to where those links are. So if all your sections have a link text of like read more, learn more, find out more, it's really hard to navigate where they're going. So if you ensure if there's several links on the web page and they all have the same name, it's really confusing. So make sure link names are meaningful, unique, and descriptive when they're out of context. So for example, in that image which says collaborate inclusively, blah, 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 at the link name for it is make your content accessible. It's not click here to find out more, because then you'll just have click here to find out more a billion times on the same page. It's not like a great experience. It also doesn't look nice. Things like, and then an example of a bad one would be the strategy one right next to it on the image. All right, great. And it's been proven to just be way more inaccessible anyways. So just make sure you're using descriptive link titles. For images, when talking about images in alt text, people who are blind or people with vision difficulties can't see images, and they rely on web developers and content authors. So if I'm uploading an image or if I'm creating a website that has an image, they rely on them to kind of describe what's happening in the image for their screen readers. So people with low vision may have difficulty reading the image of a text because maybe it's, and then this is for all folks, but maybe the image is too small or it's pixelated, contrast is not big enough. So even if you don't have, vision difficulties, it'll be really helpful if you just add alt text to your things. So alt text is basically alternative text. When you add alternative text to any image, which you can very easily, it's super simple to do in a lot of places. It basically provides informative text for images like photos or buttons. So that for an example over there, if there's the Microsoft logo that you've added to something, add alt text to it where it's describing what it is. So there's a tag there which says image source. That's the Microsoft logo image. Alt equals Microsoft logo. For things that are more decorative, like a decorative border, it doesn't really need alt text because it's just there, but the screen reader might still pick it up and it might be confusing about what it is. So they've added just a decorative alt text, which is image source, put the image name, and then alt tag is empty. So they know there's something there, but it's decorative. It doesn't need to be read by the screen reader, so you can skip that. That's really helpful. When you're adding alt text, you can keep it as short as you can, usually never more than 150 characters. So it's just best to know that. I know now you can add alt text to Instagram photos, Twitter photos, LinkedIn photos, even when you put photos in your PowerPoint presentations, or just add the best practice, just add alt text where you can. While you could technically describe it as a logo, it doesn't really describe what type of logo. So for example, that Microsoft logo, if you just type logo, it doesn't really describe much. You could not even go a step further and say Microsoft logo, 4 squares, white text, and so forth, and just describe actually what's happening in the image. You don't need to, because I think Microsoft logo is a little bit more commonly understood. But for things like maybe you're in a forest, you should probably say 4 trees, 4 maple trees with a child sitting under it or something, whatever it is, just to describe what's happening. Okay, let's move on. So that's kind of the 3 other things about digital accessibility. I'll show you a slide, which is this slide. So this is an internal Microsoft slide that we just add to our presentations for our own selves when we're creating content to talk about accessible slides on PowerPoint. So it has a really good example of like contrast, for example, where you're using high contrast colors like black on white, white on dark blue. When you're using color to describe something, you use shapes and colors. So for example, if you were talking about like a project management thing and you want to say something's in green, something's in yellow, something's in red, instead of just using those colors, you can actually use icons with it. So green is like go, red is in red X. So for example, just good ways to be accessible. And then reading order is one thing that I didn't touch on fully, but basically what order something should be read in is really important when you're thinking about your HTML formatting and so on. Michelle, can you give an example of question someone asked is, sorry, about descriptions for data tables with lots of information and if we have multiple tables on an application. So can you expand on that a little bit, Rena? I'm not sure what you really mean there, but Michelle, yep, you're right. Word, for example, will generate all text for your images on its own. It's not always the strongest or most powerful tool. It might give some random explanation, so just double check that. And Michelle, yes, I will definitely send you send examples. Oh, applications like Salesforce have a lot of tables in it. So I'm not actually sure. So yeah, those apps, I haven't actually checked the accessibility of those out, but I'll definitely look into it and share some good examples. But as a rule of thumb, those apps are built for screen readers. So for example, those images and tables are not, they're not really coded in HTML per se. App development, when it comes to tables, is a little bit different, but when it comes to websites, usually they can read it as text almost. So they'll go in order. When you say table heading, table row, it'll read it kind of like text where it's like a heading or a paragraph. It'll just kind of go through it. But when it comes to app design, it's a little bit different. We'll go to that soon. But yeah, just gonna skip through this slide. All right, so now that we're talking about app development, and accessibility in app development. So something to keep in mind, the importance of accessibility extends to all forms of technology, including digital software and applications. There's 2 key factors to consider when designing an app: the user interface and the programmatic access. So user interface is UI. UI is the means by which a user and a computer system interacts together, such as like the links or the graphics that are used. It's basically when someone sees something, what they see, like a user interface of some sort of like Spotify or even the calculator app. What is the user interface? Programmatic access, on the other hand, relates to how one app can programmatically or just access information in another app, like by calling on code. So for example, if someone's using a screen reader to access an app, the screen reader will call on the code in that app to communicate what's going on in the UI of that app. So it's kind of, I don't know if that makes sense to everybody, but happy to kind of simplify that a bit, but they kind of work hand in hand. So the user interface is how you design something and how it should be, experienced by a person, while the programmatic access is basically uses the actual code of that app. So when we type in like table header or bold or paragraph, it actually pulls on that to describe what's happening, and people can interact with the app in that way. And so there's many steps to making an app accessible, but some critical points to consider is the UI elements to use when having this programmatic access, ensuring keyboard navigation, which is a big one, and then making sure the color and contrast settings are accessible. So if you're diving deeper into that a little bit, this video is really, it's called Dev in a Minute. It uses a good job at covering everything in a minute. Here, I'll play that. So just a minute, we'll listen to it. Oh,
that controls are exposed to assistive technology.
I don't know why it's starting from here. There we go. Let me know if you can hear it. Oops, sorry about that. Oh no. There you go. Oh no, sorry, there you go.
Did you share your sound when you were, there's a little box you have to click to share your sound?
Oh, you're not able to hear it?
No.
Oh no, okay, let me try that. Well, my apologies. Here, am I? There we go. Meeting options.
It's a little box, a tiny little box on the lower left. It says share system sound.
Yeah. Weird, I can't really see it for me on Teams. Okay, weird. Well, okay, for some reason I can't find it. But I'll share the link for it, so hopefully you can watch it. I'm not sure why it's not working for me right now. Okay, weird.
You might have to unshare and then reshare.
Yeah, maybe. Okay, let me try that. And slideshow. And then share.
Make sure you hit the box.
Yeah. Okay, let's try that. Okay, let me know if you can hear it. No? Did anyone hear that? No.
No, not at all.
No? Okay.
Sorry.
No. Okay, well, sorry about that. I'll share the link out. It's basically, oh, I'm so sorry. Here.
Yeah, the only other thing I could suggest is go to your sounds and see what the mix is, the volume mix. Maybe it's not taking it from one of your inputs.
Okay, I'll definitely check that out. I know since we're short on time, I'll save the the tech support that I need to do for later, because it seems like I need to look this up again. But here's the quick video. I'll go through all this video as well, but it was just nice to watch it in a minute versus me just talking at you the whole time. But here's the video. We'll still go through the content, so it shouldn't miss anything. Okay. Well, let's skip that. Oops. All right. So, oh no, my slides. All right, there we go. There. Okay. Can everyone still see my screen? Yes.
Yeah, yes.
Okay, perfect. All right, so we'll talk about the things that the video was talking about anyways, but I recommend watching that video just because it covers everything in a minute. And so it's like an easier way to understand everything. But it's kind of just going through the details of app development, 3 key features: keyboard navigation, color and contrast, and programmatic access. So for users who are blind or have mobility issues, being able to navigate an app with the keyboard is critical. Keyboard or pressing tab is very important. However, only controls that really require that user interaction to function should be given keyboard focus, like links and buttons and form controls. So when you're kind of making something, adding keyboard focus to it, really make sure you're only giving it to the things that matter. So things like images, the keyboard doesn't really need to navigate to that. So unlike navigating with like a mouse or a touch screen, keyboard navigation is very linear. So when you're thinking about it, think about how users will interact with your product and what a logical navigation pane should be. In Western cultures, people usually read from left to right and from top to bottom. but in people who are, who speak Arabic, for example, read actually right to left. So those are things to consider when you're navigating and creating your website. If you do live in those countries where the languages flow in a different format, follow that pattern. So just think about that. When designing keyboard navigation, you should examine your UI, so your user interface, and think about questions like, how are the controls laid out, or how are they grouped? If there's, significant groups, are there subgroups for that? If there's lists between that. So for example, in that picture that's on the screen there, you'll notice it's a list. So all things in that list should be part of a subgroup. So people, when they're tabbing and going through their keyboard, for example, maybe the group should be personal identifiers, and the lists between that are in subgroups of maybe gender, pronouns, and so on, like what kinds of pronouns folks have. Just things to consider of how things are laid out when you're going through your keyboard controls. Yeah, and how people are navigating. So when talking about keyboard controls, it's a little bit more tech heavy. I'll share some resources on keyboard accessibility later on, which will actually go into like the engineering and programming behind these controls. But really the goal is to help the user understand the navigation and the navigation loop. If they go to the end of a form, if they press next, will it just go back to the top of the form, or will it go up back through the entire list together? So that whole navigation with keyboards is really important to think about. When talking about color and contrast, we've talked about color a little bit, but there's something, apps have like dark mode. There's also a high contrast mode. The UI for your app must be designed to work equally well with, when it's viewed with or without high contrast mode. So if you're using certain colors or contrasts, check them in a high contrast mode. Usually this is built in a lot of apps, but you can check how a user would see something, with the system colors, and if they're able to see all the controls on the screen. Only when talking about Windows apps, usually there's something called a Universal Windows Platform app that works on all Windows-based platforms and devices. And so like it's built in when you're using system colors. So if you're using, white, black, gray, basic system colors that are kind of in across all, coding forms like iOS apps or Windows apps, there's like a basic checker that you can go through to support high contrast themes. So that's something you don't need to worry about. But if you had an app that's like an external app, maybe you downloaded from an app store on Windows devices, like from the Play Store, for example, it might not work with the same high contrast. So if I was to turn on high contrast mode in my computer settings, that app might not work. So it's just something to keep in mind. And you can check this out. There's a bunch of, high contrast mode checkers out there that are for free, like even in browser extensions that you can check it out. But keep in mind that Windows contrast modes will be very different than iOS contrast modes, like when you're creating Apple apps. So just check those out. If you prefer to use your own color theme, make sure you're using like the color contrast ratio, and then you're using good color combinations. There's color combination also really matters. Just because it's high contrast doesn't mean the combination that you're using will work. With users with color blindness, usually have problems distinguishing between certain colors. So color alone shouldn't be used to define something. We've talked about that earlier, but really check out a different color combinations. With color blindness, it usually goes between blue-green, red-green, or red-blue, I believe. Those are also built in Microsoft as well, in Windows apps. And if you go in your Windows settings and go in high contrast, you can turn it on for those three things to see how basically your app would be viewable within a red-green color blindness. So someone who has red-green color blindness, how would they use and see your app? So just check those out. Programmatic access, we just talked about a little bit, basically how people are using your app. Without programmatic access, the APIs, which is like, we don't need to go into all the details, but people just can't use your website correctly. So it's something to keep in mind. And so as kind of a checklist for everything that we talked about, this is going to be all in that video that you can watch later too, but there's several steps required to keep track of each requirement as you develop your app. This is like an abbreviated version of the checklist that I'm telling you now, but things like setting an accessible name and description for your content and interactive elements in your app. So even things like on hover, do this, just putting text in there is really helpful. make sure it's keyboard accessible, verify your UI to make sure the color, contrast, text is all good, run these accessibility tools that are out there. They're all free that you can check out to address any issues and verify a screen reader's experience, and make sure everything follows accessibility guidelines. So in summary, today, I know we're on time now, but we talked about designing apps for people who use assistive tech, critical concepts for web dev, additional resources that I'll go through really quickly. For folks that have to jump off, this will all the slides, recordings, links, everything will be up on YouTube within the next 2-3 days. So you can check that out then. Something I wanted to mention is that disability is part of the human experience, while inclusion is a choice. So when you're talking about being diverse and having, a diverse app or diverse website, you have to realize that inclusion is more like an action verb. It's something that you actively do to make the world a better place. So, being asked to the party versus being asked to dance, there's a difference. So definitely check that out. Further learning resources like web accessibility, how people use the web, inclusive design practices, blah, 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 will all be, I'll put the links up. Here's a really fun slide that I have on brand and color accessibility, but I know we're short on time. Oh, gotta go, thanks, bye. But yeah, so here's the website. Can everyone see my screen really quickly? But here's the Microsoft Learn module where I took all the content from, where it's obviously a lot of text. But if you go on resources, you can check those out there. If you want to check the knowledge, here are just quick 3 questions. If you fill these out, you'll get the participation award and completion of the module. You can share it out on LinkedIn. So quick 3 questions. What doesn't need keyboard focus when you're making your app accessible? Static images don't really need it. To make data tables accessible in a web page, you can use native table elements. Oh yeah, this is a simple one. What text you should use, Microsoft logo. If you check your answers, continue, you got it. And then you can just complete the module and share this out. So I'll share all this content soon, but if anyone has any questions, please let us know. We definitely, would like to hear from you and see you guys, taking all these courses and taking those next steps into being more accessible as you create your own apps. Obviously, this is a very high level, but, for more technical talks, we have a ton of really deep dive technical topics that some great folks are putting on, like programming for accessibility, building web apps, building, apps in different languages like Rust, or we have coffee and code sessions coming up. So those are just some ways that you can learn more. I'll put a link to our YouTube channel that you can check out. There you go. Thank you. And if you could please, here, I'll share one more link here. There. So this is a link to our survey. If you think you learned anything today and you liked my presentation, you liked the content, or if you have any feedback at all, please take that survey. It'll just be a quick, I think it's 30-40 seconds, very quick. But yeah, it just gives me feedback on what I should change. If you think that's too content heavy, it should be less, or longer or shorter, please let me know. So when we're putting on future content, we know that, this is what people prefer. So I'm giving a couple more talks every Tuesday for the next 3 weeks. One of them's on inclusive design, so it'll be deep diving into one of these topics. One will be on principles of inclusive marketing and a couple others. So if you want to check those out, those will all be on Meetup. And thank you so much for joining. If you have any questions, please type them, but please, if you have other things going on, don't worry about sticking around while I'm answering them. And thank you so much for joining. Yeah, sorry, I rushed through at the end a little bit, but please let me know. But yeah, any questions?
I had a question actually.
Yes, for sure.
Yeah. In regards to the color palette.
Yes.
Yeah. Because the thing is, I myself, I'm actually partially sighted anyway.
Okay.
Obviously, I understand the entire concept and everything about that.
Yeah.
Yes. But in one of your previous slides where you had grays and somewhat cyan color and maybe a bluish type. Yes.
Yeah.
But thing is that I'm sure as you would know that in certain eye conditions, to have a really bright a white especially background is totally not acceptable. And normally what happens is you really need a, lead, a color like yellow, basically, if I remember, yellow background in some cases, but as you know that you got different colors and you got different shades. You can even have, let's say, for any sort of color, it can be divided into multiple amount of
Yeah.
shades, amazing amount. So, I mean, don't you think the amount of the color palette is a little bit limited? I mean,
Yeah, I mean, you're definitely right. So something like, you know, the basic 10 colors like white, blue, red, yellow. Sorry, go on.
so you go ahead, yeah, please, sorry.
Okay, okay. Yeah, no, I mean, Hamad, you said a really good point, which is that often you think just white, everything with black on top is like you're checking all the boxes, but that might not be true for everyone. So
No,
yeah,
no,
different shades
that's
help.
totally right. Sorry, that's totally right.
Yeah. So yeah, yep, you said the right thing where it's kind of like even when we're talking about basically all these colors and contrast, it's really kind of just the most basic understanding of accessibility. It's not even really going into like some people have very specific needs and concerns. So I would say like really just having high contrast and color, like color of 4:1 ratio, doesn't even tick all the boxes oftentimes. It's just like that's the bare minimum you can do. But really to be like very accessible, you have to make sure there's many versions of each thing, even when making slides or anything like that. So I definitely agree with you that yeah, you need different shades than just like white, black, blue, green.
You know what? For example, if I were to maybe let's say, for example, if I were to design a website, okay, this is my personal thing. What I would do actually,
Yeah.
if I were to design a website, or even because I'm a technical person actually by background, if I were to design a website or even an app, okay, the very first thing I would do is I would actually do a research study on it, research study, okay, but this is the key thing. This is the key thing. The key thing is that I would actually get, let's say, a group of people who actually have issues with accessibility in their daily
Yeah.
lives. Okay, because the thing is that you do get quite a lot of these either major companies or any other companies. Okay, they basically try to flaunt their accessibility credentials.
Yeah.
Yes, but when you actually really drill down on them and say, okay, then if you do really like accessibility, tell me where did you source
Yeah.
uh, support your user group basically, or your research group, okay? And then at the end of the day, they can't answer that. But thing is, I know for a fact that what they do is they just go to a professional company, okay? They say, oh, we need to do a product of accessibility, blah, 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 and everything. Yes. And the thing is, but the problem with that is that the company, they go and try and source that focus group, basically, okay? They don't have any idea. They have no idea at all, I think.
Yeah. I mean, no, you're 100% right. I mean, as people are talking about oh, we're so accessible, we're so diverse and inclusive. A lot of the time it is like lip service that people are giving, and they're not using all the resources they have to make sure they're actively trying to be accessible by talking and testing with folks who have real actual accessibility concerns like vision difficulties. So 100% agree with you there. I think, but it can be hard for like individuals. So for example, if you're making your own personal resume website or something, it's not very likely that you're going to have the resources to do a focus group and things like that. So in that case, for companies like for organizations like W3C who have like made a standard guideline for like the first step, that's just where you can start off. And if you do have resources, like definitely you should be consulting with folks and with real focus groups of actual individuals that would interact with the website. So yeah, definitely agree with you.
And just maybe the last thing, maybe.
Yeah.
Okay, so another issue I would actually bring up with you is about dexterity. Okay, because it might not be seem an obvious thing, but I'm talking about it because I actually do have issues with dexterity in my personal life or personally. So, for example, okay, so basically what it is that I obviously suffer from visual issues. Okay, one. Secondly, I've gone slightly deaf now because of the conditions I've got. Okay, two, and secondly, because of the sensory issues, I've lost my dexterity value basically. Okay, and I would say that, don't you think that any sort of website that says that, okay, we're using accessibility, don't you think they should really incorporate dexterity controls that is normally incorporated in Windows, I think. Windows. In certain applications, actually.
Yeah, I mean, in an ideal world, that would be great if people had dexterity concerns. I think nowadays the go-to is just having like assistive controllers and assistive keyboards that you can use to use.
I was just about to say that. System controllers, basically. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yep. Yeah. In an ideal world, that would be great. Like usually I think people rely on folks with dexterity concerns would just use either the arrow keys or a tab to kind of navigate through a website or navigate through content. But I think as technology is progressing a little bit now, there's really kind of high-tech technology like tools out there that you can use, like different types of keyboard users. I know in terms of, I mean, obviously I'm biased, but I know for Microsoft, they have all these different things that integrate with Windows that you can like kind of assign controls to different keys. So if they have a certain, like a third-party keyboard that they've created or some sort of control panel, you can assign what each key would do and interact with the website. So I know that's there. I know for even higher, like extra high tech, they have like eye control things that work on Windows as well. So you can kind of customize a lot.
I've heard of that one. I actually heard of that.
It's super. I've personally never seen it in my own life. Like I've only seen videos and pictures of it, but it seems pretty high tech in how people are interacting with, like, you can customize your own eye control tracking devices to use a computer in certain ways. But obviously, it's a little bit more expensive. So I think with the right assistance with like, disability assistance, then you can definitely afford that with like through the government's programs and things like that. But yeah, I definitely agree. Like you need to have, sometimes even with vision difficulties, you can't just only create something for one type of umbrella accessibility concern, like just visual. Often people are with one or two or more or 10 more concerns that they need to kind of go through. So yeah, I definitely agree with you there. Like I hope that increases quite a bit, but thank you so much for sharing about your experiences. It helps kind of realize, like, yeah, this is everyday people's lives that, you should be thinking about. So thank you for sharing.
I thank you for that, and I would definitely actually appreciate you as well. All the knowledge of basically, it's always good to learn from someone else's experiences, and someone else's knowledge as well. So it would be, for example. So thanks a lot.
Yeah, thank you, Ahmad.
Well, I would definitely like to obviously get in touch with you, for example, to do something together or something like that, or anything.
Yeah, you can definitely reach out on Meetup or LinkedIn. I put my link up in the chat a little bit, so you can contact me there.
Yeah, definitely,
Awesome.
definitely. And that'd be awesome. That'd be awesome. Thank you much.
Yeah, for sure. Awesome. Any questions before we wrap up? I know we're like 15 minutes over time now, but I'm happy to answer if you want.
Don't worry about it. You're overtime. It doesn't matter.
All right, sounds good. Trello. I've only personally used Trello just for like project management. So I'm not sure about like the app side of things in terms of the accessibility of Trello. So any specific questions about that? I personally have not used it, like looked into that too much. I only have used it as just like a user. Yeah, is that something?
I see. I was wondering about the templates. If you had any experience using like for interviewing, and if you had some like good experience with it, and which template you would use or something like that for helping out in the, or if you even have a class or something, and you need some technical assistance from the app and so on. That's what I wondered.
Oh, okay. Well, not at the moment. So we don't have any courses on Trello coming up at all, I don't think. But Trello, the company itself, might have a ton of resources out there. Let me just quickly do a quick Google. But yeah, in terms of like interviewing, I mean, I do see, yeah, they have a ton of like Trello 101 guides, how to use Trello Business, 5 best practices, sample Trello boards. So I think there are a ton there. I do see a lot of stuff out there, but personally, I haven't interacted with it too much. And even at Microsoft, we don't really use it too much. Like, it's not really a tool that we personally use, but some teams might use it by their own choice. So
I mean, is there any like similar tool from Microsoft that you use? Because there usually is for all these online courses and stuff, they use different applications, but Microsoft might have one of their own similar.
Yeah.
Or
we usually use Power BI for like similar things. So Power BI is like one of our biggest tools, just because like anything in the Power platform connects with everything else. So if we were to do something in Microsoft Word, you can use the Power platform, and like this is kind of complex, but you can use it to kind of automate something in Power BI. So you just make like a big dashboard in Power BI that connects to things like your Excel documents and your PowerPoints and like forms and blah, 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 and like pulls in information from everywhere. So Power BI is like our biggest one, to be honest. And we'll use it to like create tasks and things.
I will have a look at that. Thanks so much.
Yeah, for sure.
Thank you.
Awesome. Well, it seems like most folks have gone, so I'll end the recording here. But yeah, thank you.